Getting the streams before me. We hope. Good. There's YouTube. And there's Facebook. All right, who's with us? Where are you tuning in from? Who's first? Andrew Vasquez has joined. Welcome. Who else is in the house with us? Bryna Bloomfield says hi from Sharon, Mass. Great to see you, Bryna. Let us light up the darkness. Tom Beck says Lila Tov. Sue Strauss is in the house from Chicago. Helena Hemela, I believe, from Finland. That's it. Very good. And I like your, is it a rose or perhaps a begonia is your emoji for Finland. And Lynn is in the house from North Texas saying Hodesh Tov. Yes, my friends, Hodesh Tov. It is Tammuz, the first day of Tammuz, just about to become the second day of Tammuz as we get into the evening. This is the summer month of Tammuz. And that means that it's only about 2.5 weeks until we have a fast day, the 17th of Tammuz. And then we begin that dreaded countdown, the 3 weeks where we commemorate from when the walls of Jerusalem were breached until eventually that awful, awful day in history, the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, when the Holy Temple was destroyed. Both the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the 9th day of Av. That's next month. But that process, that countdown begins on the 17th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, and that month just began today. All right. And Edith from New York City says L'chaim from New York. Deborah Hazelwood is in from Florida. Josh Diaz from New York. All right. We have an interesting daf today with some challenges. We are on daf Kuf Tes. That's page 109 of Tractate Shabbos. We're in chapter 14. Today we'll wrap up our discussion of the second Mishnah of chapter 14 and open our discussion of the third Mishnah. The second Mishnah was the actual Mishnah. We've been discussing medications that we can and cannot take on Shabbos. The second Mishnah was actually about making salt water, making a preparation of salt water. And we learned yesterday that you can make brine. You cannot make brine on Shabbos, but you can make a little dip of salt water for your bread, or perhaps for a hard-boiled egg on your Shabbos table. You can't make a larger quantity. And just to make sure that we make a distinction between brine and just a little salt water for a dip, we might add a little bit of oil, say olive oil, either to the salt or the water before we mix, just that little bit of salt water. And some say it has to do with the concentration of the salt in the salt water. So that's how we opened our discussion with Mishnah number 2. Now we're continuing. And we had a story, it was actually on yesterday's daf, but I'll bring it down now, that Rabbi Yanai sent to Mar Ukva. So we know that in Bavel, in Babylonia, Rav and Shmuel, and we just had that meet cute the first time that Rav and Shmuel met, and theirs would become a very long and dear and productive friendship, not just a friendship, but a working relationship, as they were the chief rabbis of Babylonia in their generation. But even though they were considered the greatest rabbis in Babylonia, they actually didn't have political authority. That authority rested and was recognized by the Babylonian government in the office of the Exilarch, the Reish Galusa, the head of the Jewish community in exile. And that man was Mar Ukva. So now we're talking a little bit about Mar Ukva. Rabbi Yanai sent a message to Mar Ukva, the Reish Galusa, and said, please send us some of Shmuel's eye salves, right? So ointments for the eye. So Shmuel, right, in Babylonia, and we learned yesterday, he was just the most important guy, maybe next to Rav. Rav was a little bit senior to Shmuel. Shmuel was already established in Babylonia when Rav, who was established in the Holy Land in Israel, came from the west, came east to Babylonia and joined Shmuel there and spent the rest of his teaching life primarily there in Babylonia. Shmuel was a healer. He was a doctor. So in addition to being a great, great Torah scholar, he also had a lot of medical knowledge about how to heal various conditions. And so he was living under the authority, the auspices of Mar Ukva. So Rabbi Yanai, who I guess knew Mar Ukva better than he knew Shmuel, sent to Mar Ukva and said, please send us some of those eye ointments that Shmuel has created. So Mar Ukva sent a message back. He said, I'll send you some of these ointments, some of these preparations, lest you think that I'm being miserly and don't want to share the good fortune that I have to have these medicines prepared by Shmuel here in my house. I'll share them with you. But I'm going to share with you something more important than those eye ointments. And that's that, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Right, so Mar Ukva shares with Rabbi Yanai that he learned from Shmuel, if you want to avoid having eye problems, so make sure you wash your hands with cold water in the morning, and that's the ritual hand washing that we do in the morning. We get up and we make a blessing, and we pour on the right hand and the left hand, on the right hand and on the left hand, on the right hand and on the left hand, 3 pours on each. And that's a ritual washing that not only cleans the hands, but actually is understood to take away, bad spirits that can settle on the hands in the morning because the hands have wandered during the night. And at night, before one goes to bed, Mar Ukva teaches Rabbi Yanai in the name of Shmuel, from whom, Dr. Shmuel, from whom Mar Ukva learned this. When you go to bed at night, you should wash your hands and feet with warm water. So recall, that's quite easy for us to do. I mean, we just go to the bathroom and turn on some hot water. Much harder 2,000 years ago to wash your hands and feet with warm water. But what he was saying is it's worth the investment of time and effort and just being organized to set aside some warm water in the evening and to wash one's hands and feet before going to bed. Okay, so now we have this general principle. We've mentioned it twice already in the last 2 days. I'm going to mention it again. We do not take medicine on Shabbos. In fact, we don't engage in healing practices on Shabbos. Of course, we completely set aside that principle if a person's life is in danger. If someone's life is in danger, we desecrate Shabbos. We don't even think twice about it. We do anything necessary to save a life. For minor ailments, we don't heal on Shabbos. That in-between area is, let's say, a migraine headache. If it's going to be so painful that it's going to cause you to lie down because you can't do anything, it's not just a minor ailment, it's more of a serious pain, then you can heal. The case of the migraine headache is specified. You can take medicine for that. So for other conditions where we don't have a specific teaching, consult with a rabbi or really think carefully, how serious is it? So now in this discussion, we learned that, for example, leaves may be placed on the eyes because while they may be a comfort, kind of like a cooling sensation on the eyes, and it might, give someone pleasure, it's not healing. It doesn't have a medicinal and healing property, so that was allowed. Then a story comes up about melon juice. So melon juice is understood that if you drink juice from a melon, that this can have healing properties for certain intestinal conditions. So who was it? So Hiya Bar Ashi was having Shabbos at the home of his teacher, his Rosh Yeshiva, right, the head of his academy, who was Zeri. So it's like a student is at the home of the principal of the academy for Shabbos. He's having some stomach troubles. So the head of the academy, his Rebbitzin, his wife, prepares some of this melon juice for the student and offers it to him. And Chia Barashi says, oh, it's okay. I don't take it. It's a little bit medicinal. It doesn't work for me. Now, how could she, in the home of the head of the academy, how could her husband be okay with offering something that has medicinal, that is medication on Shabbos? And the answer is we have a principle that even if it has healing property, but if it's a food that people eat, even healthy people eat it, so that's okay. As long as it's food that healthy people would eat just to enjoy the food, we can eat that on Shabbos, even if as a side effect, it has certain healing properties. Why did Chia Bar Ashi say, no thanks, not for me, even though, not just his teacher, right? The principal of the school, the Rosh Yeshiva, it's in his house, and he would drink that juice. That's why his wife prepared it for a student, because her husband would certainly drink it if he had similar difficulties. And it's because the issue that was involved is that she would strain the melon juice a little bit. She would separate some of the liquid from some of the fruit. Now, it's important that what she was not doing is extracting juice from the inedible portion of the fruit. That's why we don't squeeze an orange to make orange juice on Shabbos. We don't squeeze a lemon to make lemon juice. There's certain situations where that might be possible. We're not going into those today. The general principle is it would be a forbidden labor on Shabbos to extract the edible from the inedible. But, on your plate, for example, if somebody gives you vegetables and there's peas and carrots and you like peas and you don't like carrots, separating the peas from the carrots on your plate, that's not going to be considered, sifting or extracting or threshing or any of those primary labors. And so here, just kind of like separating part of the juice from the other part of the juice in a way where everything is edible anyway, that was okay by Zeiri. Chia Barashi says he's a little more machmir, or a little more stringent than his teacher, and he wouldn't drink it. But the general rule, if a food can be eaten as food on Shabbos and healthy people eat it, then even though it has some kind of medicinal curative properties, it's okay to take it. Interestingly, if something is a medicine, right? It's something that's made from a food, right? Like from some kind of seeds or, some kind of vegetables or some food that people normally would not eat. They wouldn't eat it as food. People only take it as medicine. But a healthy person comes along and that's the only thing that's available and he just wants to eat it because he's hungry. So that's okay because he's not engaging in curing. He's not engaging in refuah. He's not engaging in, the act of healing on Shabbos. So that would be all right. But if somebody is taking that, medicine for medicinal purposes on Shabbos for just a minor ailment, no, it's prohibited. Okay. And this applies even for medicinal actions which don't involve eating or ingesting or drinking. So, for example, if somebody gets a cut, one thing that they would do back in Talmudic times to help, sort of stop the bleeding is dip a hand or a foot in wine. And that would slow and eventually stop the bleeding. Is that okay on Shabbos? Yes, it is. That is permitted. But if you dip the same hand or foot into vinegar, then it's prohibited. So the understanding there is that wine has a very minor, application as some kind of treatment to stop the bleeding. It helps a little. It doesn't help so much. But vinegar, maybe more astringent, is going to have a much stronger effect, when you place your cut in it or whatever. And so that would be too much engaging in healing. Obviously, if you cut yourself and you're bleeding hard and it becomes a danger, you do whatever you need to do. You heal, you put compress on it. If you needed to tie tourniquet, anything you need to do to save life. If one has an infection, we understand that even a small cut, if it becomes infected, can become quite serious. So we would be very careful about that. But on this difference between dipping a hand or foot into wine versus vinegar, we get two additional teachings. First, you can dip in wine, you cannot dip in vinegar. But if you're like the delicate people who live in Mechoza, so those people, they're so refined, they're so fine, they're so upper class, they're so delicate. Right? These are people who don't work hard. I guess maybe they all have servants. They don't spend a lot of time outdoors. Their skin is much more soft and supple. So for them, dipping the foot or the hand in wine is going to have a much stronger impact than on the regular people in the rest of the country. So for the delicate people of Mechoza, they can't dip their foot or wine to stop the bleeding in wine either. Right? They can't dip the foot or the hand even in wine because they're so delicate. So then a story comes up. Who was it? Dipped his foot. He was injured. Yeah, so Ravina happened to come to the house of Rav Ashi, and he saw that a donkey stepped on the back of Rav Ashi's foot, and Rav Ashi sat and immersed his foot in vinegar. So, of course, Ravina said to Rav Ashi, haven't you heard of the teaching that we're not allowed to dip a hand or a foot in vinegar? Because it's too much like healing on Shabbos. So Rav Ashi says, when the injury, when the wound happens on the back of the hand or the top of the foot, this is considered a dangerous wound, and because of the danger, essentially we would desecrate Shabbos. We will allow the dipping of the hand or foot into vinegar. I'm not sure why the wound on the back of the hand or the top of the foot is considered dangerous, but perhaps because the skin on the top of the hand or the top of the foot is quite thin. Right, the skin on your palm or the skin on the sole of the foot much stronger, right? It's just much more weathered because we handle things so often. But on the back is considered more delicate. A wound is more dangerous, so they would dip in vinegar. With regard to therapeutic bathing, therapeutic bathing. If you're going to go bathe in certain healthy waters, right, because you need that as a therapy, first, if it's life-saving, you do it, end of story. If you are going to bathe in waters that people would enter for pleasure, then it's okay. But if it becomes clear that the reason you're bathing in those waters is for the therapy of some kind of minor ailment, then it is prohibited. Now, it's important to note here that the rules of bathing and swimming on Shabbos, there's a whole bunch of other prohibitions that have to do with difficulties like that you might splash water, and if you go in a public pool, you might splash water and it'll go more than 4 cubits so that the water would have traveled because it's essentially like you threw the water. Or you might wring out your bathing suit or wring out your towel, and that's one of the prohibited labors. So there's a lot of restrictions on swimming and on bathing, which are actually separate things, on Shabbos. And right now, we're not talking about those. We're not talking about those. If you're interested on the law, the halacha of swimming or bathing on Shabbos, we've talked about it before. You can easily Google it. But right now, we're just talking about the distinguishing between entering the water to cool off just for pleasure and lingering in waters that have some kind of healing properties. And so, for example, the ocean. Somebody, who just wants to take a dip in the ocean to cool off on Shabbos, that's going to be permitted just with respect to the law of healing. Whereas if they go into the ocean because the salt water is good for whatever skin condition they have, sometimes eczema is quite aided by spending time in the ocean. It actually helps me. But you could not do that on Shabbos, right? Just vis-a-vis the laws of healing on Shabbos, you couldn't linger in the ocean just because it's good for your skin on Shabbos, whereas you might be able to just enter and take a dip to cool off. That brings us to Mishnah number 3. We'll cover this one pretty quickly, and then I'll get to your comments and questions. Mishnah number 3 has to do, again, with we may eat what healthy people eat, even if it cures, but something that is not normally eaten cannot be eaten as a cure. though it may be eaten as a food. So it's that same principle again, but now the Mishnah is going to list certain specific foods, like ezoveyon, which one may not eat on Shabbos because healthy people do not eat it, and it's medicine. However, one may eat a plant called yoezer and may drink abuvroe. Okay, abuvroe. Furthermore, all types of food that healthy people eat may be eaten by a person for medicinal purposes, and one may drink all drinks for water, except for water from palm trees and a kos ikarin. So there's some specific foods that are mentioned here. We're not going to go through the analysis of all these specific foods. The one that is prohibited is this ezovion, which seems to be a hyssop or perhaps a white sage, and it's a cure for worms that one gets from eating barley flour that was left out for a certain amount of time. So that one we're not allowed to eat. However, one may eat the yoezer plant. Now, the Gemara asks, what is yoezer? The Gemara answers, it is a vegetable known as putnak. And for what is it eaten? It is eaten to cure liverworms. Now, I'm going to read this passage about how, what it's for and how they take it. And what I want you to think about is the fact that this very much sounds to us like a primitive folk remedy, right? I mean, we understand that for a medicine to be a medicine, there must have been large-scale clinical trials supervised by the Food and Drug Administration, tested widely, make sure that it's not going to be dangerous. God forbid something dangerous does slip through. There's going to be, big litigation with lawyers and pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So none of that existed back then. How did they know that some particular treatment treated some condition? It was wisdom that they picked up over the years, over the generations, not through large-scale trials, but through small-scale trials. And that's why so often in the Talmud, when we're told about a cure, they'll say, you should do this. But if that doesn't work, then you should try that, right? And so it's over time they picked up that, just like they didn't have these scientifically, precise medicines that were made for precise conditions in the human body, they had a much more limited pharmacopoeia, as it were. Still, over time, they said, okay, this thing will work for some people, but not for everybody, because people are different. Their chemistry is different. So if this thing doesn't work, then you can try this. And if that doesn't work, you can try that. And if you think about it, it sounds primitive, but it is the furthest thing from primitive. It's not primitive at all. They just didn't have the same scientific instrumentation and large-scale trials available to us. But the process by which they arrived at this string of cures was very methodical. And so given what the technology that was available then, you can see that over the generations, it was actually a very sophisticated process that led to trying these. So here's an example. Okay, so there's this vegetable known as putnak, and what is it? And for what is it eaten? It is eaten to cure liverworms. With what is it eaten? It is eaten with 7 white dates. From what do worms come into being in the liver? From eating raw meat with water on an empty stomach, or from eating fatty meat on an empty stomach, or from eating ox meat on an empty stomach, or from eating nuts on an empty stomach, or from eating fenugreek shoots on an empty stomach and drinking water thereafter. And if one has liverworms, but does not have any putnak handy, or if one has taken putnak and it did not help, he should swallow white cress. And if he does not have that, or if it did not help him, he should sit in fast, not eating, and take fatty meat and place it on coals, and suck the bone and swallow vinegar. And some say one should not drink vinegar because it is harmful to the liver. And if none of those options are available, or none of them work, let one take the sawdust that was scraped from the shell of a thorn bush from top to bottom, and not from bottom to top, as perhaps then the worms will come out through his mouth. And let one then boil the scrapings in beer at twilight, and the next day close his nostrils and drink it. And when he defecates, he should defecate on the trunk of a palm tree. Now, a lot of this stuff it sounds almost like magical thinking, like, oh, you're going to do this and that and this step and that step, and somehow that's going to, appease, maybe some angel or demon which is bringing that sickness to you. But it really is the result of generations of trial and error. These things are taught in the Talmud because they worked, right? That's why they were recorded. And it is a very sophisticated process by which these things came into being. Now that we're talking about worms, and people get worms, tapeworm, etc. And so now that we're talking about tapeworms, so then we get into a little bit of a digression about snakes. Now, one who swallowed a snake. Now here, Rav Steinsaltz tells us one who swallowed a snake. It's not really he swallowed a snake. It's he swallowed a tapeworm. Here, the word snake is referring to a tapeworm. So he should be fed hops and salt, and then he should be made to run a distance of 3 mil. A mil is sort of, I think it's on the scale of about a kilometer, more or less, So the idea that somebody would eat a certain food and then have to run 3 kilometers, but it's on Shabbos. Well, actually, these aren't even discussions of Shabbos, right? So these are actual healing treatments, so you can't do this stuff on Shabbos. So during the week, you would eat this hops in salt and then run 3 kilometers, or you might have to run it in place, like around the yard. But this is going to help a person who's got this condition. And the Gemara relates that Rav Shimi bar Ashi saw a person who swallowed a snake. We think it's a tapeworm. And Rav Ashi appeared to that person as a horseman. And Rav Shimi fed him hops with salt and made him run in front of him for 3 mil. And the snake came out of him in pieces. And now that we've been learning a little bit about this treatment, like, that you might have to get rid of this tapeworm. So now we're talking about a snake. And then the Gemara relates another story. And it says there was a certain Jewish official in Pumbedisa that was bitten by a snake. Now it's really a snake, right? Not some kind of tapeworm that's being called a snake. He was bitten by a snake. And we've already learned a treatment that has to do with extracting something from a white donkey. And there were 13 white donkeys in Pumbedisa, and they looked inside of all of them, but they were found that the donkeys were not kosher. They were treifas. There was something wrong with the lung of the donkey. I mean, a donkey's never a kosher animal, but here, for the purpose of this healing, I guess the donkey needs to have its lungs intact. And there was one donkey on the other side of Pumbedisa, and until they went to bring it, a lion ate it. And so Abaye said to them, since all of these things have happened, perhaps it was a snake of the rabbis that bit him, for which there is no cure. As it is written, one that digs a pit will fall into it, and one who breaches a fence will be bitten by a snake. That's a teaching from Ecclesiastes. That's kind of a general teaching. The first one is great. One who digs a pit will fall into it. That's like that Chinese saying, one who's intent on revenge should remember to dig 2 graves, right? When you're just like so intent on harming someone else, you may well come to harm yourself with your plan. But the second part of that verse, Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 8, and one who breaches a fence will be bitten by a snake. What does this fence refer to? The sages erect fences around the Torah. A rabbinic decree is a fence around the Torah. Meaning, God told us what we can and cannot do by biblical commands, by Torah commands. And we've learned so many times, that the rabbis will then issue decrees to make sure. The Torah certainly doesn't say you can't take medicine on Shabbos. Why did the rabbis decree that you can't take medicine on Shabbos? Because people will come to grind the medicines, and in grinding those medicines, that's where they will violate Shabbos, because it is a Torah prohibition that you cannot grind on Shabbos. So the rabbis create a fence around the Torah, and now this verse from Ecclesiastes says, one who breaches a fence will be bitten by a snake. Now, we've encountered a bunch of times this idea. When one violates a Torah prohibition, if he did it unwittingly, he can bring a sin offering to atone for his sin. If he did it intentionally, It's a heavier penalty, and his fate is in the hands of heaven. Okay, so the rabbis issued decrees just to protect us from coming to violate a Torah prohibition, right? It's a fence around the Torah to distance us from sin, and therefore there's no specific punishments for violating rabbinic decrees. But what we're learning here, what we're learning from this teaching, the snake of the rabbis, is that we are told, it is a general Torah law, that we obey the rulings of our sages in every generation. So that's where they get authority. So while there's not going to be specific punishments doled out for violating rabbinic decrees, now we're learning, well, there might be, right? So if you're egregious enough about it, if you violate enough of the rabbi's prohibitions, if you're doing it in a way that's going to undermine their authority in the eyes of the rest of the community, so then you might come to be bit by the snake of the rabbis. And that is a big deal, as we shall hear. So this man, this official, was bitten by a snake, and they couldn't find the cure. They knew the cure for that kind of snake bite, but for some reason they couldn't find the donkey that they needed to get the material out of it to cure his snake bite. And so, Abaye said perhaps the reason they couldn't find the cure is because this particular snake bit him, not just a random snake, but a snake of the rabbis, for violating rabbinic prohibitions. And they said to him, yes, my teacher, it is so. As when Rav died, Rav Yitzhak bar Bisna ruled that one may not bring myrtle and palm branches to a wedding hall to accompany bells. And this person went and brought myrtle and palm branches to the wedding hall with bells. So there was a funeral going on. It was the funeral of Rav. Rav Yitzhak said, okay, we can do this, but we can't do that. I'm not sure exactly what the ruling is, why the myrtle couldn't be brought. For whatever reason, they couldn't bring it. Maybe it was Shabbos, maybe it was some other prohibition. But the point is that the rabbi who was in charge said, you can't do that. And then this person, this official of Pumbedisa, did it anyway. He violated that rabbinic decree, and he did it publicly. And therefore, a snake bit him, and it is reported that ultimately that official died. And Rav Steinsaltz tells us, the snake of the rabbis. Rashi states that one who was bitten by a snake as punishment for ignoring the decrees of the sages has no cure and will die. If one recovers from that snake bite, he will eventually die from another snake attack, because one who violates the decrees of the sages is punished by death. So while there's not specific punishments for violating a decree of the sages, it's a problem. Your fate is going to be in the hands of heaven, and eventually, it's going to get you. It's going to catch up with you. So the laws that are passed by the rabbis for our protection have the full force of law. It's just that if you violate them, if you do it unwittingly, you don't bring a sin offering, you just move on. But you want to atone, you want to make teshuvah, and you really want to ask yourself, how did I put myself in a position where I violated a decree of the sages, before you come to violate one so egregiously, or violate so many of them that, God forbid, heaven should decree, God should decree, this guy's gone too far, and one of these snakes will come along. Because then even in modern times, with all the technology in the world and all the snake bite cure and everything, the snake of the rabbis, if we're bit by that, no cure. All right, that's what I've got for us today. Let me see your questions. Tom Beck, what about a chronic illness for which you need to take medication every day, or say injecting insulin? So Tom, we can answer this question, right? If somebody has a chronic illness and they don't take their medication, they're going to be in danger, right? Certainly if a diabetic doesn't take his insulin, he's going to endanger himself. So that kind of medication is absolutely allowed on Shabbos. Or rather, we desecrate Shabbos in order to take that medicine, and there is no penalty, and one shouldn't even hesitate. Of course you take that medicine. Bill Eldridge, in addition to the back of the hand and the top of the foot being thin-skinned, There are also major veins located in both places. Good. Thank you, Bill. That makes a lot of sense. In fact, you can see my veins right there, right? So you can see those veins. So a cut there could easily become a very serious injury. So even if it isn't actually life-threatening, it would certainly look and maybe feel life-threatening to have a wound there if one nicked those veins. Thank you, Bill. John Shore, who is a doctor, checking in. Many medicines are required to be taken every day. Missing one day can have bad consequences. So the question is, must one take that kind of medicine on Shabbos? And the answer is yes, absolutely. You do not break up a regimen and endanger yourself in any way. It's really what we're saying is that the healing that we don't do on Shabbos is for minor ailments. Kathy Renninger Heinlein says, I give up. I'll just die from the liver worms if that happens. You're not going to go through all those cures. Listen, Kathy, thank God you live in the modern age where if you get one of those conditions, there's going to be, proven effective medicines. But then, what could they do? They would go to somebody who had a lot of wisdom and who was not just well-versed in what he'd learned from his masters, but maybe even well-traveled and well-read and has a lot of communication with people outside the village. I mean, listen, back then people got around much less. There was no internet. There was no phone. There was barely a postal system, right? If you had to send a message to someone, you got somebody to deliver the message for you. So somebody that had broad knowledge in those times, it was an epically important thing to have that kind of broad wisdom and to have enough experience that you could bring down some kind of healing procedure that had been tested, that had been learned, maybe in some other community, and bring it back to yours. Bill Eldridge says, that sounds shaky to me. It seems as if every time someone flouted the rabbis and died old in their bed and would look suspiciously like a referendum on their rulings by heaven. You're saying somebody who flouted the rabbis and then did live a long life. Well, who knows? Who knows? Who knows what other good those people were doing? When we say that someone's fate is in the hands of heaven, it's in the hands of heaven. But what the sages are saying is you could easily shorten your life by engaging in these practices. And this is a general important principle when it comes to the sins of others. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know what's going on in other people's life. We don't know all the good they're doing. We don't know all the bad they're doing. We don't know why they do the things that they do. And so we're very careful. We don't judge other people. Now, if we see them doing something wrong and perhaps they don't know that it's prohibited, so we would pull them aside privately. We make a rebuke privately. Because as we learned back on Daf, what was it? It was Daf 43 in Tractate Brachas, 43 Amud Beis, side B. We learned from Rav Zutra, right? Mar Zutra Bar Tuvia, in the name of Rav, that it is better to jump in a fiery furnace than to humiliate another person, right? So if we're going to tell somebody, hey, you're doing something that looks a little bit like a transgression, like a sin, we would say very privately, very gently, just to make sure that they know that is our duty. That is our duty. It's like saving somebody from drowning. And by the way, this question came up many weeks ago, and I'm pretty sure I answered it, but just to, worth saying again, one big difference between halakha and, like American law, like the law of the culture, is that if you see a person drowning and you just let them drown, you don't have liability in American law. You haven't committed murder. You haven't done anything wrong if you allow that person to drown. You didn't cause the drowning, but you don't have an obligation to save. Under Jewish law, you do. You do have an obligation to try and save. You do not have an obligation to endanger yourself in order to save another. You do not have that obligation. But to make your best effort to save a life, you are obligated. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. May we all be blessed to be healthy, to not need any kind of healing on Shabbos. May the Shabbos that is coming up find all of us in peace and full health and wholeness, as well as joyful and filled with meaning and prosperity. Sending you all my best, big love to my holy sisters and brothers from LA.